Well, hello there. I am your guest host for tonight's conversation, Israel Balderas. It is 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 11 p.m. London time, 1 a.m. tomorrow in Amman, Jordan, and it's 4 a.m. in Hotan, Xinjiang, China. Thank you for joining us here in the U.S. and around the world. Please let us know where you are joining us from in the chat box. The international community of the Society of Professional Journalists is dedicated to promoting press freedom globally. We're also helping American journalists see the close links between global and local events. And that's what we do. We bring together journalists from around the world to better understand the conditions and the troubling issues facing all of us right now. Just because we don't see it, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be paying attention to it. Now, the format for tonight is quite simple. The guest and I, we will have a conversation. We want you to be part of that talk. If along the way you have questions, please use the Q&A function. I will try to work it in as the conversation progresses. We want to keep that chat box free to help share information. Now, this talk is being recorded, and then we will place it in our YouTube channel. The co-chair of the international community, Dan Kubisky, is putting the URL for that in the chat window right now. And with that, let's get started with tonight's conversation. You know, the Pandora Papers and the Panama Papers have shown that global collaboration among news organizations can bring complicated stories to the public and have an impact on society, not just here in the United States, but around the world. The latest collaboration project is the Xinjiang police files. I'm going to try to get that word correct by the end of tonight. 16 news organizations received verified copies of documents that outline efforts by the Chinese government to eliminate the Uyghur culture in the northwest province of Xinjiang. The U.S. partner in this effort is USA Today. Now, we are fortunate tonight to have with us Dierdre Shesgreen, World Affairs Editor of USA Today. She and the team of USA Today reporters produced a series of stories based on those leaked documents. Welcome, Dierdre, to tonight's conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Happy to be here.
And I want to make sure I pronounce your last name correct. It's Shesgreen?
Shesgreen.
Shesgreen. Wonderful. You know, before we get to this amazing story that you were part of, I always say I'd like to get to know our guests. So, you know, why did you become a journalist?
I had always been interested in politics, even when I was a kid, but I knew I never wanted to run for office. And then I discovered that I loved writing and telling stories and that I could combine those two in journalism.
How long have you been a journalist? And tell us a little bit of how you got to where you are at, because you have an amazing job right now.
So I studied French in school and then in college, and then I went to grad school at the University of Missouri. And then I've had just a series of jobs in journalism, starting in Alternative Weekly, making my way up to a daily paper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where I worked for 10 years, and then eventually found myself at USA Today. Mostly I've covered Congress, but then, you know, about 5 years ago, I decided that I'd had enough of that and I wanted a new beat. Foreign Affairs was open, and so here I am.
Tell us a little bit about what you and a team of reporters at the USA Today uncovered. First, let's just talk about the Xinjiang police files. What are they?
So these are Xinjiang police files. These are leaked documents and photographs that we got from a source that I had interviewed before about China's mass internment of the Uyghurs. I had spoken with him. He's an expert on this particular topic, and I had interviewed him for a story after the U.S. Declared what China was doing as genocide. They labeled it genocide. So I did a story about, you know, what the evidence for that was, and I talked to this researcher named Adrian Zenz. And at the time I pitched him, I said, hey, you know, if you ever get another big set of files, or you have some big findings, consider bringing it to USA Today, because he had collaborated with media in the past over, big research projects. So he did take me up on that and came to me with the Xinjiang police files. He says that he got them from a hacker who was able to get into 2 local police networks in Xinjiang and extract these files.
Now you mentioned that you worked with Adrian Saenz. You interviewed him right after the Trump administration had declared that what was happening to the Uyghurs in China was a genocide. No other government had ever called what was happening inside the country, labeling it genocide. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and the Biden administration continued with calling what's happening in China genocide. But tell us, again, as journalists, how did it come about? How long did it take? Not just to develop the relationship that Adrian would trust you and the series of news organizations that took up these files, but how long did it take to develop this story? Because I can imagine you had a lot of things to deal with. One of them being, were these files, can they be verified, right?
Yeah, it took months. It took months of work on our own and with the other news organizations to work on this story and to see how much of it we could verify. We couldn't verify all of it. I want to be very clear about that. There were steps we could take to verify certain elements of it. And we made sure in the story to say, here's what we found that, supports Adrian Zentz's conclusions. And here's what we still, haven't been able to fully vet, basically. But yes, it took a long time. Part of the issue, I don't want to give you a specific timeline, because part of the issue was that, after we got them, then the Ukraine war started, and that, absorbed a massive amount of time of all of us. And we ended up, kind of pushing things back a bit. So there was, there were a lot of mitigating circumstances, I guess.
You and I had a conversation earlier today, and I was quite impressed with you for the following reason, and maybe you can detail this a little bit more. But right when this story was starting to develop, you actually got a second job at USA Today. Tell us about sort of what was happening at USA Today for you, and then as a journalist, how you were trying to balance, your new responsibilities versus trying to make sure this story was told.
Right. Well, before Mr. Zenz reached out to me, I had agreed to take temporarily an editing job to fill in for our White House editor who was going on maternity leave. And then I got the files, and we said, okay, it should work out, because by the time I'm done with that job and the regular editor is back, I should still have time to work on this. And then at the end of it, they asked me to actually take a different editing job, kind of a hybrid job, where I'm world affairs editor, but I'm also a reporter. So I have people, a couple of reporters and a bunch of freelancers that I supervise. And then I'm also supposed to be able to report my own stories. So this story was not ideal, an ideal one to sort of road test this new hybrid job, but it worked out in the end.
A journalist trying to balance multiple huge international stories, I can sense a lot of journalists watching this going, yep, that's me, whether it's at the local level or it's at the international level.
Right.
14 news outlets across 11 countries were part of this consortium. Before we get into the details of the story, tell us a little bit about behind the scenes. What was it like to work with different organizations? We're talking about the BBC, we're talking about news organizations in Germany. How did this collaboration work?
I would say that was definitely the best part of doing all this. One of the most rewarding is that it was a really collaborative effort. We had a a chat, set up a text chat, and we would talk about, who had found what, and how to share information. And we had calls that were, where we sort of discussed where we were. It was just a really, it was a very good collaboration, very productive, very friendly, very, very collegial. I really enjoyed that part of it. I mean, yeah.
You mentioned earlier today that each news organization brought in their strength. This is the website from the BBC News. This is their report of the Xinjiang police files. You mentioned that the BBC, they were good at contacting people, trying to interview others that could verify this independently. You mentioned that the folks in Germany, they were good with the tech, the data, geolocation. Tell us a little bit about how each news organization brought in their strength to be able to work together to make sure that this story was solid.
Mm-hmm. So it was just kind of organic, to be honest. Like by the time, so at the very beginning, we were sort of all doing our own thing. And then I had already interviewed a couple outside experts who had peer reviewed Zen's research on the files. So when we first started collaborating, I said, okay, I've already interviewed these two people. I will share the transcripts or whatever. And then the BBC said they had already, found, they were already hunting basically for relatives of people named in the files. So they kind of took the lead on that. The folks in Germany kind of took the lead on the open source technology verification, looking for metadata in the photos and seeing if they could geolocate, that kind of thing. So it was, it was a very sort of easy, natural process.
One of the important ethics in journalism, especially one that SPJ tries to talk about, hold seminars on, would be the idea of verification, right? Independent verification, and making sure that our sources, that we as journalists verify what our sources tell us. Tell us a little bit about who Dr. Adrian Zenz is, because he plays a role in what happened after the stories were published, in that China attacked this individual directly. They've been doing this for a long time because of his work. But tell us a little bit about him, who he is, and then how you went about making sure that what he was providing was sound truth and verified information.
Yeah, so before my supervisors agreed to go ahead with this project, I knew who he was when I, before he even approached me. And then in addition, when I went to my editors with this story, I said, okay, here's who he is. He's, worked with the BBC on this kind of thing in the past. He's been, quoted extensively. So we already knew he was a fairly known quantity, particularly when it comes to the Uyghurs and Xinjiang. He is a senior fellow for Chinese studies at the Victims Against Communism Foundation, which is an organization that was founded by an act of Congress, but is funded by private donations. So, that's, and I knew, because as you said, the Chinese government has attacked him before. I knew that, and I knew what his response was, and I kind of anticipated that line of attack.
Let's talk about the files. You did mention that the files were inside computers in police stations, 2 police stations in the region of Xinjiang. And these are the files that are there, right? We're talking about 2,800 images of detainees. We're talking about 300,000 personal records, 23,000 detainee records. And not only that, but within these files that this hacker was able to access, he also accessed speeches given by administration officials in China who have connections with President Xi Jinping. How would you, as a journalist, when you saw all this, how did you plan to attack all this document, for lack of better word?
Well, it was that this was definitely, it was incredibly difficult. I mean, for one thing, I don't speak Mandarin, so that proposed a challenge from the get-go. You know, when I got the documents, I was opening them and thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to approach this? I mean, obviously the photos speak for themselves. And my instinct, even without the language hurdle, was that this was a visual story, because really what it is a photographic record of mass internment. And it's the story of these human beings. It's the first real extensive visual evidence that we've seen from inside Xinjiang, from Uyghur, inside the detention of the Uyghur people. There have been other leaks, but not this kind of visual evidence, this visceral evidence that shows you the human toll. In terms of the actual documents, what we ended up doing was Zen's translated some of them, and then we hired an independent translator to go behind and double check and make sure that the quotes were accurate. Is that what your question was, or were you looking more at the substance?
Well, I think both, right? Because you're talking about a lot of information. And this, again, comes from just 2 computer networks at police stations in the area. So this is just a lot of information that now journalists, citizens around the world can access. But certainly as a journalist, and again, you know, because we are trying to give advice to journalists, whether they're covering, right, a local police station in their hometown, or we're covering China. It's always great to learn from other journalists like yourself as to how do you tackle such a big project. And I can imagine that along the way there are fears, right? And, you know, do we have the information correct? You know, are we being played? Are there, you know, bugs in the data? All those things are things that I can imagine as a journalist, you have to be confident in the work that you have done for all these years, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So we had a lot of internal discussions about our level of confidence, and about, you know, being careful with the files themselves, because of, you know, potential malware. There were just a lot of concerns that we had to run through, to make sure we were, you know, comfortable with the story in the end.
You mentioned that this is not the first time that we've gotten information out of China. This is a video that was released and posted to YouTube back in September of 2019. I remember this story very well. It was very powerful because it showed detainees, you know, under guard, blindfolded. And as you can see, you know, again, it's not just a few, it's hundreds of them. What made the Xinjiang police files that much more powerful than what we've seen leaked out of the Xinjiang region over these last few years?
I think it's what I was alluding to before, which is that you have the faces and the names. You're putting personal stories, personal names and faces to this mass internment. So it's not this anonymous thing. It's not, you know, the label of genocide. It's, you see the people who have been impacted by this, and, you know, from ranging in age from 14 to 73. And you find out some of their stories, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, one of the people that the BBC interviewed, his wife is photographed and her ID number is in the files. And he said he thought she had been killed in the camp. And, you know, he hasn't seen her in years, and he saw her photograph and said she looked destroyed.
Um, the issue of the Uyghurs, what's going on, the fact that the United States, I would argue, is leading the efforts to say what's happening in China is genocide. We've seen these interviews before of individuals who were there, who were in the jail, of parents who don't know where their children are. What is the one takeaway after doing this story that you came away with? What stood out for you?
So I think in some ways it's the lack of a global response. I mean, we've known about this for a long time. Those stories have been out there. The testimonies from former detainees has been public for a long time, and yet the world still isn't responding in a way that you would expect when there's a potential genocide happening.
We're going to get to that, the response in just a moment. But what has been the aftermath, both for USA Today and for all the publications who have reported on this since this story became public?
Yeah, so once the stories were published, there was a pretty strong response, international response from leaders in Western capitals, from London to Washington, people saying that this was, these were shocking new revelations, and that there needed to be a real investigation into China's actions. Since then, that has died down, and it's not clear to me that that there's going to be any staying power. I don't know yet. We'll have to see.
One of the things that happened right when this story was being published is that simultaneously you had the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, visiting China right when this story broke. Tell us a little bit about who Michelle is, her background, and what was the significance of her visiting China when this story broke?
So she had been trying to get meaningful access, quote unquote, meaningful access to Xinjiang for a UN investigation into the human rights situation in Xinjiang for years. And she agreed to a visit. It's not entirely clear what kinds of restrictions were placed on them, but the US State Department said that whatever she agreed to, they didn't specify what it was, but they intimated that she had agreed to a number of restrictions that would basically prevent her from doing a real investigation. And she has not responded specifically, as far as I know, to these disclosures so far.
This is the way the Dispatch put her trip there to China. The Dispatch is a conservative news organization. This is what they wrote in their story. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet's recently concluded visit to Xinjiang was a disgrace for Bachelet personally and an institutional failure for the United Nations. It was also a stark reminder of China's determination to advance its own set of norms at the expense of universal ones of democracy and human rights. I was struck by the fact that Michelle Bachelet could have canceled her trip. That would have sent a powerful message to China. She certainly could have taken questions from journalists. It is our job to hold officials accountable. She also could release reports from the United Nations detailing what they've concluded is going on in Xinjiang. And yet nothing, as you just mentioned, has been said from her office. As a journalist who is tasked with holding powerful people accountable, what's your sense of that?
Yeah, it's a bit perplexing. She has promised to release a report for years. Human rights groups have criticized her for stalling on that, what they say is stalling. It's not clear when that report is coming out. And it's also not clear how much influence the Chinese government will have over her findings. So that will be the next real big test, I think, in terms of both the power of these stories and then the international response to them. Yeah, it's perplexing. I'll leave it at that.
And she's a former president of Chile. She's also a torture victim of the Pinochet dictatorship. We're talking about here, Dierdre, a detention, not just one or two, but many detention camps in this region of China. We're talking about 1 million Uyghurs, right, who are, locked away, no due process. We've heard stories of women who can no longer have babies because of, what they call medicine that China has given to them. And yet China says these are just re-education camps. They will oftentimes in their own news, in their own television shows, say that they are moving Uyghurs and Cossacks from certain regions to give them a better life. They'll often say that their parents are nowhere to be found, even though sometimes they've been placed in detention camps as well. They're orphans. China tries to say that what's happening with the Uyghurs, we're trying to do good by them. And at the same time, they're also using the language that they claim that the Uyghurs pose a national security threat to China. Tell us a little bit about whatever you can about the history of the Uyghurs in China.
Yeah, so the Uyghurs mostly live in the Xinjiang region, which they consider to be East Turkestan, and there is definitely a segment of the population that supports, a separate state or some form of, independence from China. And there have been sort of more militant groups in the past who have resorted to violence to protest the Han majority's rules. The Han majority's rule. But the Communist Party launched this, what they called the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism in 2014. And that was sort of the beginning of this mass internment. And researchers like Adrian Zenz and other experts say that the threat from the Uyghurs is minimal, and that the Chinese response has become sort of paranoia and extremely exaggerated.
As I understand it, this kind of crackdown on the Uyghurs started in 2014 after there was a terrorist attack, an individual with a knife killing multiple individuals. The president, Xi Jinping, is the one who initiated this crackdown. And now we know, thanks to the Xinjiang police files, that high individuals, administration officials, high in the Politburo, high in the Chinese government, have connections to Xi Jinping. So what has been the international reaction from world leaders as to how they're going to hold the Xi Jinping government accountable for what's happening there?
So, I mean, interestingly, that a lot of the immediate reaction from this story was to call on Michelle Bachelet to do a real investigation. It's not clear that there will be additional steps in terms of like sanctions or more governments labeling this genocide or working to isolate China in any way. They're really trying to put pressure on the UN to expose this.
And you were talking about sanctions, not just around the world, but the United States. What has the United States done under the Biden administration? I know Anthony Blinken did take up that call to say that what was happening in China was a genocide. But what else has the Biden administration have done? And what are people who are trying to expose what's happening in China? What do they say? What else more could be done?
So the U.S. has sanctioned you were mentioned that there were speeches as part of these documents, including from one of somebody who at the time, Chen Guangzhou, who was at the time was charged with implementing the internment campaign in Xinjiang. And he basically outlined a policy of treating Uyghurs suspects as hardened criminals to be shackled and hooded if necessary. And if they tried to escape, that you could shoot to kill, basically were his words. The US has sanctioned Chen and other Communist Party officials. That was in 2020 for their role in the mass internment, and those remain in place. They've also worked to try to ban imports of anything from Xinjiang that can be shown to be made with forced labor. So those are some of the steps. And then basically the label of genocide, I think, is, trying to publicly call out China.
You mentioned banning imports from the region of Xinjiang. It's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. President Biden signed it into law in December, and it's going to take effect on June 21st. As you just mentioned, it's going to treat any goods from that region, either whole or in part, as a product of forced labor. China, how have they reacted to, again, this attempt for America, the United States, to hold China accountable?
So China has responded by rejecting all of these accusations and, angrily denouncing our stories as lies and saying that the people in Xinjiang are living happy, productive lives, and, lashing out and trying to undercut and discredit the reporting and the Biden administration's any administrations that are trying to call them out on this.
Yeah, and it's not just the United States, it's governments from around the world. For those of you who are watching, don't forget, Dan is posting a lot of these stories that we've been talking about, that we've been showcasing, in the chat box. Also, if you have questions also that you would like to ask of Dierdre, not just of her fine reporting here, but what else she's doing as far as now the coverage at USA Today, please post those questions. And we'll definitely ask them of Dierdre. We'd love for you to join our conversation. Dierdre, it strikes me when it comes to the Uyghurs, they are mostly Muslim, Sunni Muslim at that. 80% of the Uyghurs are Sunni Muslim. Are you surprised that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Countries, these are countries in the Middle East, who I would think they have an interest to not just speak out, but stand up and forcefully lead this international effort to say what's happening in Xinjiang has to stop. And yet nothing has been spoken of by the OIC.
Yeah, it is a strange silence there. I'm not sure how to explain that. Frankly, I didn't really report that out as part of my story, so I don't want to, make any guesses on that. But it is perplexing that there has not been a more vocal response from the Muslim world to this situation.
I've gone to the Xinjiang website, the Xinjiang police files, and I've done my own, research from afar. For example, especially the detainees. What I appreciate about this website, and I'm sure these are the documents that you and the dozens of other journalists worked at, is that you can dive deep into this data, right? If I want to know, if I want to see these mugshots of, women under 30, I can do this. I did find one night when I was kind of working my way through this, I selected one or two individuals, their names. I would Google their names, and sure enough, I would find a story. One was an AP story of a father in Turkey who didn't know where her daughter was for a year. Now, this was before the Xinjiang police files were released, but this really brought it home that what wasn't known for years is now known. Have you gotten that kind of feedback that now people are saying, see, we told you so, sort of thing?
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly the sense from the relatives who were quoted in the stories that, they're saying, now I know, and they knew that their family members were missing, but they didn't know their fates. And yeah, just to say that, we've been saying for years that the Uyghur people are in danger of disappearing, and this is visual evidence of that.
You will find a lot of this when you go through the files. This one stood out to me. The reason that this individual, precious individual, and I want to make sure and say her name. Somebody should say her name. Hawagul Bekri. She is now 29 years old. And she was detained and put into an internment camp because she was doing illegal study of scriptures. I can only imagine it was the Quran. What were some of the things that you found that these individuals are arrested for that just sort of blows our minds and brings it back home to Americans who should be outraged by what's happening in China?
Yeah, the alleged infractions were felt sort of Orwellian in some ways, studying scriptures, thinking extreme thoughts, picking quarrels and provoking trouble was used frequently, sort of seeming like a generic term that they would come up with. Growing a beard, those kinds of things, having too many children.
And every one of them billed as re-education camps. This is the idea that the Chinese government wants the Uyghur people to be and think and act like the rest of the population, right? That is why China has moved over the last few years most of the Han population from the east of China into this area. And they really want to get rid of a culture, of a people, of a religion that dates back centuries to the region, right?
Right. The idea, I mean, the Chinese government says these are vocational schools and job training centers designed to stamp out extremism and prevent terrorism in the region. But, experts say these are actually, detention camps designed to stamp out their culture, ban them from speaking the Uyghur language, ban them from studying the Quran, and, cut ties between, cut people's family ties, and really just stamp out the culture.
Right. That's why America calls it genocide. Now, Dierdre, this is probably the hardest question. It's the hardest question for a journalist to answer, because we are trained to think we're not part of the story. We're reporting the story. And certainly our code of ethics says that we seek the truth and report the truth. And then sometimes we move on to other stories. So this is my question to you. Most Americans look at this and they go, I feel bad. That's sad. But at the end of the day, I'm here in North Carolina. You're there in Washington, D.C. Some people may be in Europe, and they go, what can I do? Right? It's sort of why should I care about this? After all, there are atrocities around the world. We've got a war right now that is leading to, the possibility of famine in some parts of the world, because Ukraine is, the breadbasket to the world. What do you tell? You always say if your mom read or saw your story, what would you tell her? What do you tell people after reporting on such a huge story like this?
Well, it's good to put it in the context of China's place in the world right now, and they're a rising power, and there is sort of this. The Biden administration has framed it as a competition between authoritarianism and democracies. So it's potentially helpful for us to think about it in those terms, and that China is seeking increasing dominance in terms of not only its economy, but also in terms of its form of government. So
yeah, and Secretary of State Blinken has called China the most serious long-term threat to world order. You cover the White House. Again, from the Biden administration's point of view, do they take China seriously? How, again, in balance with Russia, in balance to domestic affairs, like we are, in an inflationary period. Where is this, when you see your reporters from the White House, where's the administration placing the issue of China? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
they have definitely tried to make China the number one, issue, but obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine upended their plans a bit. But Secretary Blinken gave a speech a week or two ago, basically saying that the U.S. was not going to let the war in Ukraine distract them from the challenge that China poses. So it's pretty high on the radar in the White House, definitely.
We've seen other stories as we start heading down and closing this conversation. We've seen stories of the Uyghurs over the last few years. I've gone through the headlines. Lots of news organizations have been reporting on this, and yet nothing changes. A year from now, 2 years from now, Dierdre, if we have you back on the show, would we be saying the exact same thing? Nothing has changed. Is this going to be an issue that unfortunately has been going on for decades in the internal affairs of China? Will this just keep going, or are people now more hopeful that something may get done?
That's a good question. I'm not sure, and obviously don't want to speculate too much, but I'm a little pessimistic, to be frank, about whether there's going to be some dramatic change, because even before this story, there was a lot of evidence about what was going on in Xinjiang, and it has not resulted in action. So we will see.
This is how you put it. This is your byline. This is your story. By the way, definitely, if you can read her story. This was a couple of days after the Xinjiang police files was published. This was your follow-up. Appalled world leaders call for action after hacked files detail Uyghur internment camps. You've had a wonderful, illustrious career. You are now at the top of your game. Where do you place this story and what you were a part of, the consortium, the collaboration, the placing USA Today, on the top of news organizations around the world? Where do you place this story?
I definitely think it was one of the most challenging stories I've ever written. Certainly one of the most, rewarding in terms of just, working on something that is meaningful. So I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but
it's tough, I can imagine.
Yeah.
But certainly
Who knows what's to come.
Right. All right. As we close out here, again, we are the Society of Professional Journalists. We fight for the First Amendment, and we fight for ethical journalism. I'm curious, Dierdre, after working with a story like this, after seeing what powerful people are doing or not doing, what does press freedom mean to you?
I think it means the ability of journalists to report freely and fully on government decisions, to hold powerful leaders accountable for those decisions, and to foster an exchange of ideas that helps the public become informed or stay informed and participate in the public arena.
I'm teaching the next generation of journalists here at Elon University. That's what I do. I'm a professor. I teach First Amendment law.
Great.
What do you tell the next generation, those people that are coming behind us, and it's going to be up to them to expose what's happening, to report, to hold people accountable? When you talk to the interns, when you talk to the young reporters, what do you tell them as far as this is a job worth doing, even though the data shows that the public doesn't trust us, they're tuning us out, and democracy doesn't look that wonderful right now, not just around the world? What do you say to the next generation?
Well, I say it's more important than ever because of exactly what you just said, that democracy is seems fragile at the moment, and we need to build up the public trust in journalism. And so, yeah, this is more important than ever, and accuracy and balance is more important than ever, as well, to build that public trust. So, and professionalism. So, yeah, it's a noble career.
Yes, it is. I miss it. I got to be honest with you. So keep at it. Dierdre Shesgreen, thank you so much for spending your Tuesday evening talking to us about the things that we here locally need to be focusing on globally. Thank you so much. By the way, you can get more information about all the upcoming programs by subscribing to the International Community Weekly Newsletter. Dan, he is putting in the URL right now for the IC webpage, which includes a newsletter subscription form. Fill it out. This is the kind of fun we have here. And we bring on amazing journalists like Dierdre right here on the show. Now, Dan has also included a link to the latest newsletter for your reading enjoyment. You will note how nice and short it is. We do like short reading. By the way, if you are not an SPJ member, again, I'm a board member, and I think my board would be very angry with me if I didn't tell you right now is the perfect time to sign up. You can also do that through the IC. What are we doing at SPJ? This is what we're doing. We are making sure that reporters like Dierdre or around the world have a chance to report on important stories, to hold people accountable, to expose what's going on, to defend the First Amendment, and to make sure we do it in the most ethical way so that the public can trust us and that it can be better informed. If you have any ideas for future programs, by the way, reach out to the international community through the website. Again, Dierdre, this has been such a wonderful conversation. What's up next for you, by the way? Anything cool happening since are you still covering the White House, or are you back?
No. So I was the White House editor, but now I'm the World Affairs editor. So I'm focused. I'm pivoting back to a lot of Ukraine stuff for now.
Oh my goodness. You're not going to have an easy summer, are you?
No, no, definitely not.
All right. Well, good luck with that. Please be safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we can have you again if we need to ask you about what's happening around the world. Dierdre.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for watching,
All right.
and we'll see you next time.